Good evening. I'm Betsy Taylor, the Managing Editor of Health Progress. Welcome to the St. Louis Press Club's panel discussion on covering news in contentious times. The St. Louis Press Club is for those who make, cover, and influence the news. Its mission is to award student journalism scholarships and for enterprise grants to journalists for underreported topics in our region. It serves its members through professional development, social, and educational activities. In recent months, news professionals have had to think strategically about reporting at protests, reporting in a time of a pandemic, and also at a time of significant political divide. The upheaval at the US Capitol last month, where we all saw cases of journalists targeted while doing their jobs, led us to invite our panelists here tonight to tell us about their recent news gathering experiences. We will have a Q&A as part of tonight's discussion. You can use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to ask a question. You may want to wait a bit to pose questions so that we'll see them later in the discussion. Now let me introduce our panelists. Joining us tonight are Elliott Davis, investigative reporter for Fox 2's You Paid For It. He's well known for investigations into government waste in our area. Elliott also co-anchors evening newscasts on Fox 2, KTVI, and Channel 11, KPLR, on Saturday and Sunday. Audrey Prywitch, Vice President of News for KTVI and KPLR, will talk with us about the sorts of considerations news executives have to consider these days. Another panelist we're so pleased to welcome tonight is Debbie Monterrey, a radio host of Total Information AM on KMOX. She also reports and anchors broadcasts on that Entercom station. Our fourth panelist is one we'll turn to for slightly different context. Joseph Martineau is an attorney with Lewis Rice. He focuses his practice on media and communications law. He's also been an adjunct professor at Washington University for 20 years. He can speak to the First Amendment, defamation, and communications law. I wanted to start tonight by asking our panelists how the local news environment has changed. I'd first like to start with our three journalist panelists to see if they think reporting is more difficult now than in the past. And if so, could you give us an example of how you've seen that? I think we'll start with Elliott and then move on to Audrey and Deb for this question. And I have a follow-up question for Joe.
My answer is yeah, it's like night and day. There's a dramatic change now over what it was before. Just dealing with the pandemic. Overnight, things changed. Things that were important before to viewers, I don't think they, when the pandemic hit and got in full steam, they didn't care about. So investigative reporters, for example, we do stories of how, say, maybe officials spent $5 too much for a paperclip or whatever they were doing. And so those stories would get on the evening news and we'd say, hey, and we'd be chasing whoever it was. Well, all of a sudden, I think viewers didn't care about that because they were dealing with a life and death issue. I went from, for example, doing investigative reports like that on a lot of different issues, some small, some not really consequential, being honest, but to us being in a pandemic situation. And so I got shifted from investigative to general assignment, where I was out in the field every day. And so I had to kind of learn about the technology. But the key was we had to communicate information to people about a pandemic that was killing people, and they were anxious for information. How did that change my job? Well, before I was running after officials, and before they were all the bad guys. In this new environment, people wanted to hear from officials, to hear what was going on. So you had to have kind of relationships with people. And I think what helped me was that people knew that I was fair. So even if people didn't like the reports, they said, well, he's fair. And so how that helped was we were able to talk to the mayor and get him to call back, or a senator, get him to call back. The journalists in North County who were talking about how, for example, African-Americans weren't getting the testing that they needed. So I was able to get these guys to call back. So yeah, I think everything changed in terms of what voters were interested in. And I think that, and I'm not gonna step on Audrey's deal, but news directors had to make that consideration of how do we best use our people? Where do we send them? And so Yeah, being out in the field, I found that everything just changed dramatically. Um, the last experience I had like that was like the flood of '93, but this was 10 times more, where we were taken out of that investigative rotation and put into the realm of reporting on what people cared about. And so I think we had to start our day as reporters each morning saying, what do people care about? What story am I going to do today? So I'm not going to talk about the paperclip, but what's related to the pandemic that people care about. So it definitely changed your job. Did it make it harder? I don't know if it was harder, just different. So I think you just had to adjust and then move forward in the new realm.
Audrey, how about you?
This was just one in a series of challenges and learning experiences for us professionally and personally. Elliott and I went through Ferguson together. I had to worry about Elliott when I couldn't reach him one night, surrounded by an angry mob and a car on fire. And from that into George Floyd, protests, and racial division, plus social media and dealing with that. And then we went into the election and politics. So it was one thing on top of another, and then the pandemic, and then the division. And it has been a challenge. And I feel like Elliott and I and the people in the newsroom have been at battle for a very, very long time now. The pandemic was just one more layer, although with that came a heavy, heavy toll. When you talk about what Elliott would report on all the communities ripped apart by this global pandemic and what it did to our folks in our viewing area.
And Deb, what's your experience been like?
There, I was muted, I apologize. I totally agree with what Audrey is saying, in that it's like you're in this battle and it's all coming at you all at the same time. I think news gathering in general has been really challenging, especially over the past 4 years, but the last year is like nothing that I have personally ever gone through. And unlike television, radio has been able to do a lot more remotely, so that most of our employees at Entercom St. Louis work from home. I've never been able to work from home because I do the morning show and there's too many moving parts. So I have always gone in every day. But that also means that the workload is enormous because the people who are home can't necessarily do everything they need to do. So that puts more on us, but also we have to deal a lot more with all the angry calls that come in because we don't have anybody answering the phone. So it's all of this workload, all of these people calling who are angry about everything. And when things are happening, it's the challenge of, I'm like one person in the newsroom trying to keep the station on the air, trying to do stories, trying to anchor the news every half hour. And there's a protest. Well, who do we send? Because our bosses have to be sensitive to, is this somebody with compromised health? Can we send someone out? We're trying to cover a lot of stories with Zoom conferences because there's no more news conferences in person, and we're an audio thing. So the audio is not always great. So it's this huge challenge of, well, do we even use this story? Because the audio is terrible. I mean, so there's so much coming at you all the time. And like Audrey said, it wasn't just the pandemic that really, it just made everybody have to pivot. Do we work from home? How do we do this? How do we organize? Just communicating with people, because you're trying to Slack people, you're trying to email people, you're trying to figure out where all your people are. What stories are we going to cover? It was, for the first probably 5-6 months, it was extremely confusing. And then for me, I felt like I had that added challenge of just dealing with a very angry, fearful audience that's just very quick to flare. And I got extremely, I would take it home with me every day. I would be really upset at the end of the day and just exhausted. Just every time I'd get off the air with a newscast, the phone would ring and I would almost flinch because I would just know it was someone who wanted to argue or debate or tell me it was fake news. So it's been an exhausting year. I will just say that, but I have to say it does feel like that pressure has gotten better. So I'm feeling a little more hopeful here in February of 2021.
You know, I kind of look at it like I would equate it to, as a reporter out in the field, being like a combat soldier. And you go from one battle to another. And it's a different battle, but it's a battle nonetheless. And so, like, as Audrey said, we started off in Ferguson and George Floyd, and with the pandemic, which was the absolute worst. But it really is like going from one battle to another, and you just kind of reprocess and say, okay, brain, we're going to this battle now. We're going from the battle in Italy to battle in Germany to France, but it's still a battle nonetheless. So reporters have been on a constant war footing. And I know we're going to talk about social media later, and I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to it.
Great,
but yeah,
great.
it has been a battle.
And I think everyone's going through so much at the moment, but I do think it's a really unique moment in news gathering as well. And Joe, I know you've written and taught about how the news environment has changed. And I'm wondering if you can walk us through a few of the factors that you see as contributing to a shifting news environment. And particularly, are there legal considerations that have made reporting and gathering news more difficult than it used to be?
Yeah, I think, you know, my view on this is going to be a little broader than your all's. I haven't, you know, noticed a huge change from, you know, legally with respect to COVID and everything else. I mean, obviously there's been a lot going on, and I understand all of that. But from a broader perspective, what I've noticed is, and I'm sure something that you've all noticed over the last 2 decades that I've been doing this kind of work. We've got a 24-hour news cycle now that we didn't have 20 years ago. We've got social media, as Elliott just mentioned, that, you know, really wasn't as pervasive as it is today, and it just seems to be getting more and more pervasive every day. And then from, you know, from the perspective of the news media, the near instant way that news is reported. And then you've got the competition among professional journalists who are competing to some extent with the social media reports. And that's led to instances, and you're asking about the legal issues, that's led to instances where news sometimes is not vetted as carefully as it would have been in years past. An example of that would be, you know, what occurred in the early January of 2019 with the Covington students and at the Lincoln Memorial. I'm sure you all remember that incident with young Nicholas. And in fact, there's a photograph here that was taken from a YouTube video that was widely broadcast at that point in time. And the initial reports of that event were very critical. I'm sure you all recall that, of the young man who appears to be smirking at Chief, I think his name was Nathan Phillips. And as it turned out, the situation was much different than as it was initially reported. And that led, from, again, getting back to legal issues, that led to lawsuits. The Washington Post was sued, CNN was sued, and last January they both settled. Now it was a confidential settlement, so we don't know what was paid to young Nicholas Sandman, but obviously something was, and that's a, you know, that's a legal issue. You know, it's very easy for me to say it as a lawyer for the media, but, you know, I generally try to advise, and I think you all follow that rule. I know you're very responsible journalists. Be right, not first. And don't rely on social media posts without double checking those posts. And I think to some extent, that's actually what, from my observation, happened in the Covington, the students at Covington Catholic High School. And traditionally, I'll say one more thing. Traditionally, and we've defended many a lawsuit for some of our local media clients here, that, you know, we were just relying on the AP, or we were just relying on the Washington Post, we were just relying on the New York Times, so therefore we should have a defense. It's called the wire service defense. That defense, I think, still applies if you're relying on traditional media, where the traditional media has properly vetted the news articles. If you're just relying on a Washington Post story or a New York Times story that was based on social media, then I think you're going to have potential problems in relying on the argument that, well, we were just relying on reputable media. So that's what I've noticed over the last 20 years.
Thanks, Joe. And as a former AP reporter, I have to say, of course, the AP is almost always right. And I do want to ask a related question to this. We'll start with Deb on this one. And again, it's helpful if I can do the journalists, and then Joe will come back to you. I'm wondering about, has there been a big switch from offense to defense in reporting the news? And by that, I mean, do you spend a lot more time having to debunk misinformation on the internet compared to how it used to be? Can you just sort of say, I'm going to focus on the actual news and the rest will sort itself out? Or are there things that just are so prevalent on social media that they have to have time given to them? Also, if there's anything you've learned that would be helpful to other journalists, I'd be interested in hearing that too.
I think there's been a lot more blowback, and I think there are a lot more you have to consider in terms of, you always have to be cautious, but I think there's a greater degree of caution right now because there's so many people that are more critical than in the past. I remember back, in the old, I've been around for 40 years. So I remember back in the old days and stories you do where you get a lot more public sympathy and the public was kind of with the reporters and the job that they were doing. I remember when my photographer got shot and we had so many people and so many well wishes, so many, so much love from the public.
I remember that, Elliott. That was something when that happened. About 17 years ago, is that right?
Yes. Larry Washington. But there was so much, it seemed like public goodwill, or a lot of stories we would do. And it seemed like there was more just public goodwill, like people were predisposed to side with the reporter or say, hey, they're just trying to bring us what's going on, what's happening. And so you kind of get a benefit of the doubt. Yeah, we believe this is true. We believe this is happening. We think this is a problem. So you kind of have the public on your side. And so I think what I've found now is that there is a little more vitriol out there now. And I found a lot of that on Facebook. We had up to, I think I had 171,000 followers on my social media page, for example. But the other side of that picture was that I was getting so many hateful comments on that page because there's a rise in tension. I think someone mentioned it, is that there's an anger out there right now. And so whatever you would, put on there, you'd have just a lot of opposition. And so I was spending 3 hours a day just trying to deal with that.
Right.
Sorry
to interrupt you. I'm going to ask Deb about, I know you mentioned going into the station and having to pick up the phone. And my sense is that you may be handling calls from people who, because of their point of view, whatever it may be, they are leading more with feelings than facts. Would that be fair to say?
Definitely. I think that the term fake news is so pervasive now among our nation that it has come to be anything that I don't like, anything that I don't agree with is fake. And when this really first started, I think a lot of us in the newsroom would really try, when people would call and start arguing with us, we would present the set of facts that we had to show or prove our side of the story. And as the last few years have gone on, some people in the newsroom still do. I honestly don't really bother at this point because there's no point. I just say to people, okay, thank you so much for calling. And I hang up because it doesn't really matter what I tell them or the facts that I present, because they will not be convinced. And that makes my job difficult because, like Elliott said, there used to be a time when we would get the benefit of the doubt, and I think that time is gone. And so what we have to do is just make sure that we can back up our story and that we can go forward confident that we have done our job. And if somebody wants to argue or say that it's not true, there's really not much that I can do about that. And I just have chosen over the last couple of years to not waste my energy arguing with people on the phone or on social media who are not going to believe anything I say anyway.
Right. And Audrey, I want to ask too about the shift between, I think anyone with a lot of experience in journalism knows part of the job is you have an element of power in what you do. And there are going to be people who don't like a story. But this environment just seems so different to me. You know, it used to be like, oh, look at this letter I got, you know, somebody didn't like my story. And what happened maybe twice a year or something. Now, in some cases, it can really be constant. And if somebody goes after somebody, which I think is a fair phrase, on social media, it can be pretty prevalent and pretty hurtful, I think. And I get that people have thick skins, but it seems to be more than that to me sometimes.
You're absolutely right. I had jobs in high school, and my dad would tell me the customer is always right. So don't argue with the customer. I think about now where we see our viewers as customers. So it's a really, really hard space to live in, because when our talent is abused, whether it be a woman, you're too fat, you're too ugly, going after them for their perceived political persuasions, their sexual persuasions, whatever it is, when it gets so personal, it's really hard not to fight back, and you hurt for them, but you also don't want to become the problem and engage. So it leaves you sort of like what Debbie's saying, is just retreat, hang up. And I saw the shift. I used to proudly wear my Fox 2 hat and my t-shirt and my jacket, and I go for a walk in the neighborhood and someone's honking at me. And I thought it's somebody, my neighbor, and I turn around to wave, and they're like, ah, and they're, you know, we hate Fox. And he's honking his horn, and they were throwing me some of the love signs. And it made me realize then how divided we were becoming, and people think Fox is Fox, and it's not. We just carry their programming. So it's been very difficult to mind our manners, have self-respect, but I don't like to see the talent, the behind the scenes people screamed at, like Debbie's saying. And I just finally said to them, if you're cussed at, or if you're some derogatory comment, you are free to hang up the phone, because I do not want you subjected to that.
And that's a real switch. And Joe, I want to ask you a question on this. As someone who works with many media outlets in St. Louis and a lawyer, can you walk us through what's protected speech and what crosses over into what seems like hate speech?
Yeah, I will. Let me say this first. I've represented, and I always tell everybody I know this, I've represented journalists for many years, and I respect and admire what you all do. I've never met a journalist in my life that wants to report fake news. And I think I am so offended whenever I hear that term, that this is fake news. It may be wrong, but there's a difference. And there's no journalist that is out there that I've ever represented that is interested in reporting a false fact on purpose. Now you mentioned the term hate speech, and I'll say this: the term hate speech really has little relevance in a traditional legal sense. The Supreme Court has recognized very clearly that derogatory speech focused on race, sex, sexual orientation, religion, something like that, and the like, cannot be punished in a criminal way or even civilly. The First Amendment protects hate speech. We've seen examples of that with the Westboro Baptist Church, the folks that protest the military funerals, and in an 8-to-1 opinion, the Supreme Court said that no matter how outrageous the speech, it was protected by the first speech. But you need to differentiate hate speech from hate crimes. The Supreme Court has also held that there's nothing in the First Amendment that prohibits a state from taking, or law enforcement for that matter, from taking acts which are criminal in and of themselves, independent of the speech, and enhancing the sanction or the punishment or making it a hate crime. So you can have hate crimes, but you've got to differentiate it from hate speech. An example, I could spray a hateful motive or put a swastika on my front door. There's nothing criminal about that, but it's clearly hate speech. But I couldn't do it on yours without consequence. And that consequence could possibly be greater than if I just painted a happy face on your door. They'd both be criminal acts, but I could be punished to a greater degree for putting that swastika up there because of the hateful motive.
I do want to, sorry, Joe, I don't want to.
let me just
I
add this.
think I'm going to move on to a related question. And I think one thing that I think a lot of us in St. Louis saw this summer in particular is that I don't know if any of you had this experience, but journalists in St. Louis were getting called by journalists in other cities because people thought journalists here had a lot of experience with covering protests. And so I know obviously the pandemic has put a new wrinkle on all of this, but are there steps related to personal safety that are very different from in the past? And again, thinking of other journalists, journalism students, we'll keep it pretty quick, but any tips, any steps you've taken that are very different? And Audrey, we'll go to you.
Yes, because Elliott and I have lived this. We used to get out there with our gas masks, and he had all the utility stuff, and then it got real when somebody nearly got their head shot off. And we just kind of looked at each other as a newsroom and said, this is not worth it. I had Betsy Bruce, who was teeny tiny in a flak jacket, and one of the executive producers looked at her and burst into tears. This is not what we went to journalism school for. We made a decision editorially and as a station, never to go back into the fray. We then became the story. Look at me with my gas mask on. I'm going to take a selfie. It became all about the people in the middle of something that was very real. We had no place there. We made a conscious decision not to go back. We have a helicopter. We're very lucky. Anything that is going on, we cover in the air. We have no place there in those protests. And people think that's going to make a great resume tape. You'll also maybe get your head blown off because this is very real. County police have actually called us and said, oh my gosh, I cannot believe what the other stations are doing and putting their people in harm's way. At the end of the day, a minute 30 package is not worth losing a valuable life. Just not.
Okay. Of course, of course. And Elliott or Debbie, do either of you want to take that? Elliott, maybe you?
Yeah, just to piggyback on what Audrey was saying during Ferguson, it was an arduous call and a management call, because when you are out in the trenches and you have the adrenaline's going, everything is going, you got your gas mask, there's riots, there's all of this stuff going on, and you're caught up in the moment. And that's where I think the news managers really had to make the call. Pull out, move out, because we want to cover the news. We want to say, hey, this is going on, this is happening. And yeah, it obviously it was certainly an issue that we have to deal a lot with safety out there. And a lot of it was more the managers looking out for us, people like Audrey looking out for us out in the field. One point I just wanted to make before I miss this point is that one of the big changes now with the pandemic and the Capitol and all the things going on is that getting lost in the shuffle many times of the issues facing minority groups, like African Americans, for example, that may have gained a lot of traction before all of this started happening, that we focus on poverty and we focus more on crime and all of these issues. But when you got to the pandemic, everybody was suffering. And so viewers were less engaged in that, in the issues as you tried to go and do stories on minorities. And so it becomes a matter of trying to make sure that African-American issues, and Archie's been good about that and emphasizing that in a newsroom, but that obviously a station has to be even more engaged to make sure they don't get lost in a shuffle, because when you deal with a pandemic and everybody's suffering, it's hard to make people care about one group. So that's a big difference, I think, in what we're doing now.
That's a good point. And Deb, did you want to address any differences in how you covered the news in the last year or so?
Well, I was just going to say that I never really thought that I would see a time when in a radio newsroom, we've got bulletproof vests and helmets, but we do. I think our bosses have been, and our news director has been of the mind, like Audrey, do not put yourself in harm's way. We all went through that during Ferguson and other incidents where we had reporters, almost injured, almost shot. And I think that's one way. I mean, a lot of these protests, honestly, have happened around our radio station downtown. So that has actually been a little helpful because, you can kind of poke out there a little bit, and if things get crazy, just head right back to the station. But I think that's one example of when social media is helpful, because when there are protests or riots, there's so many people live streaming and Facebook living and getting audio that you can kind of collect that and make that sort of a way to give a snapshot of what's happening without having to put a reporter in the middle of it.
And Joe, I know this is an area that you can help us out in. I'm wondering if you can talk about how a member of the media should prep in advance of covering news that may involve a high level of conflict. Should they bring the phone number of a lawyer with them? Should they, it used to be that you were absolutely supposed to show your ID. Now, sometimes they say, have it on you, but don't show it because the media can be a target in ways it didn't used to be. And I'm also wondering, it's a three-parter for you, Joe. If you're in a situation where the police are asking you to do something and you feel as a reporter you have a right to be there, should you push back a little? What's sort of the appropriate thing to do in a situation like that?
Regarding the last question, that used to be the issue that we would be called the most about, was we're being harassed by law enforcement. We're being told that we can't be here, we can't cross this police line. And that was always something that would come up from time to time. Until Ferguson, I never really saw Ferguson and then Stockley, the protests with Stockley and everything else. I never saw instances, and this probably goes to something that Elliott was saying earlier about the respect that people generally had for the news media, and I think most people still do. I certainly do, but we never had that problem of the people participating in those kinds of events harassing the media. And now the issue is kind of almost the opposite. So we will advise in a peaceful protest where it's truly peaceful. I think it is a good idea for the reporter to have their credentials at least available, because a lot of times when you see, and we've seen this over the years, a lot of times there's no recognition between the law enforcement officer and the journalist, and things just get blown out of proportion before you know it, and someone's arrested. But if a police officer or law enforcement does, they have the gun, they have the billy stick, and they have the handcuffs, and courts are generally going to side with the law enforcement officer, and as long as their request is reasonable, they're going to prevail. It's not unreasonable for the journalist to try to rationally convince the law enforcement officer that, hey, I'm just doing my job, I'm not raising any threat to anybody, let me do my job. But if you are firmly instructed to leave, I think you have to leave, or at least go back to where they say you should go back to.
And I'm going to ask at least one more question, but I would like to open the chat up for questions. So if our audience members have questions on these topics, please put them in the chat, and as I ask questions, I'll look at those as well. And one of the things that I think is really, when people talk about fake news and you talk about how maybe the public perception of some of the media has shifted over time, is there value in trust building in different ways? And by that, I mean, should you draw back the curtain a little more on the news gathering process? Do you need to do more explaining of how and why you're reporting the news that you're reporting? And I feel personally that there seems to be a little bit less of an understanding than maybe there was a decade or so of sort of the role of the press and that sort of thing. So I'm just wondering if you explain to people why you're doing what you're doing. Does that help at all? Or am I hoping for too much there?
I don't think a lot of people want to hear an explanation right now.
Okay.
I think it's so divided that people have chosen their sides. They're either over here, over there, and depending on where they think you are in the spectrum will determine, which side may listen. But I do think, and I try to be objective as possible. I try not to seem like I'm siding with this side or that side, but you still, you'll have things that will be even innocent, and you'll get attacked, for a particular view. So I don't think that you could explain the whole news operations. You could explain how you gather news, and I don't think you'll make a lot of converts. I think people will just attack you for whatever you put on. I think they'll attack you for that. So I think basically, and Audrey will agree, that I think that you kind of go about your job the best you can. We build in checks and balances. So I have managers that will check my script, and executive producer to make sure it's balanced and to make sure we're presenting the news as fairly as possible. So, you know, I don't think that we can give people a seminar. This is how we gather news, because I don't think it'll matter if you explain it.
Okay. Does anybody have a different opinion on that?
I will say that Elliott's right, but we do try to be transparent in the process. And a lot of times people do want to see behind the curtain. So we will explain things to them. And even if we're wrong, we'll say, we knew an hour ago that we thought we were hearing this, but now we're wrong. We're hearing this now. That's really important. It's really important to have clay feet. It's important to show them the process. And
it sounds like kind of building it into the coverage, right? You're
Exactly.
talking about Elliott saying, don't give them a lecture, but be really transparent throughout the coverage.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I agree with that 1000%. Yeah,
And
you know,
I think that for a lot of St. Louisans watching the news, to know us personally gives them, the viewer or the listener, a little more faith that we would be giving them the straight scoop because they know who we are. But even that is not a saving grace, because I'll have people call and they'll yell at me about some story that I did, and they'll say, "Now, I like you, you're a nice person, but," and then they'll just, you know, continue to excoriate me for the story that I did that was terrible. So like Elliott said, I just think at this particular place and time, and maybe that'll change, there are just people who they've decided what they believe, and that's that.
Okay. And I do have a couple of questions coming in from the panelists. I do want to ask one question that I got from Dale Singer, who's on the press club board, because I like this question a lot. And he asked, could panelists discuss language choice when covering protests? Does your newsroom have guidance on when to use words like protest versus riot? How do you describe law enforcement actions in a particular situation? And more recently at the Capitol and even the events at the downtown St. Louis Justice Center, how do you know what words to use in a rapidly evolving news environment? And let's start with maybe Audrey on that one.
Our company, Next Star Broadcasting, every quarter we have to go through a content review where we pull the staff together. We have one Friday and Monday, and we talk about this. We talk about words. We talk about identifiers. We talk about blue collar. We talk about white collar. We don't use mugshots anymore. And we talk about when to use words and when not to use words. So it is very important. Our language has never been more important. Protesters versus rioters, Betsy, we talked about that a little bit. This country was built on protests. Every American has a right to protest. There is a difference between a protest and a riot where there's property damage. And so it's really important when you talk about Black Lives Matter protesters, those aren't rioters. And it's incredibly insensitive and hurtful. And we as a newsroom internally have to be sensitive to that, and also to our viewers. So language has never been more important, and also how we refer to people's sexuality. And all those things have had a sharper focus, and I think it's one of the offshoots that's making us better. It's forced us to really have some thought into the language.
And Deb, do you want to address that one?
I think it's been a challenge for our newsroom this past year, because that would normally be something where we would all be in the newsroom discussing that, you know, how do we address this? How do we do that? But instead, we're all in different places and news is breaking. But I agree with Audrey that protester versus rioter was probably the big thing for 2020. And we have the added challenge at KMOX that we have talk shows on the air, and the talk show hosts are going to choose different language than perhaps the reporters do. And not everybody who listens is going to differentiate between the people doing the talk show who are trying to generate calls and, you know, get people riled up, as opposed to the newsroom where we're trying to be more sensitive. So it's always this constant battle. But I think that the pandemic for us, at least as far as I feel has put that extra challenge on, because we're not all together discussing these things. And it's almost after the fact, you go, hey, you guys, maybe we should step back and do this instead of that. But by then, maybe you've already upset a few people. So that has definitely been a pandemic challenge for me personally, I think.
What I would just add to that, having been a reporter out in the field, certainly in the beginning where we were doing reports for every newscast, and reporters having to make decisions on the fly or making pretty quick decisions about what word to use. A lot of it's communications. So in the old days, we get on, go live, and we wouldn't worry, not trying to insult anybody, obviously, or anything like that. But, you wouldn't worry a whole lot about it. But now, because we are aware that words are important, and as Audrey said, a protest as opposed to a riot, a lot of it now involves communications with managers and communications with management, and saying and calling and saying, well, what do we call this? What do you think about this? What do you think about that? And getting some guidance and direction. So it is getting more feedback because it is critical.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback, I'm sorry, really quick on what Debbie said about we don't see each other anymore. The first time I saw Elliott in a year was last week, because we're separated now. They are out in the field. It does make it even harder. So I could not agree with you more.
And Joe, any legal distinctions that people have to be really mindful of when it comes to choosing their language? I would think so.
From the perspective of a journalist and what they say, I mean, I think so much depends on perception. And, I always harken back. It's such a tough environment nowadays for you all. I always harken back to Bill McClellan's oft stated compulsive outrage disorder, the COD, that everybody is offended by everything. And that's a risk that you take every day with every word that you use, that people are going to be offended. Legally, I'm not sure that, in the employment context, if you use a hateful word about, about someone who happens to be a minority or something like that, obviously that's going to be evidence of potential discrimination, but not as far as how you report and what words you use in your report. It's just going to be how the audience reacts to it. I don't think it's a really legal issue.
Okay. And we do have a couple of questions coming in from the audience. Let's see. I have one from an audience member who's asking, have the citizen journalists who take and broadcast their own video, etc., helped or hurt the profession overall? And do such journalists deserve the same legal constitutional protections that professional journalists do? And with these chat questions, maybe we'll have two of you chime in rather than all four. Is there anybody, raise your hand if you want to take that one.
I'll take that one.
I can answer it.
Go ahead.
Legally.
I'll let him go first. You go first.
I'll go Joe and then Elliott.
It's a short answer. I mean, legally speaking, the First Amendment applies to them just as it does to a professional journalist. There's no license that a journalist gets versus an ordinary citizen. So it's really not, I can defer right now to Elliott, because it's really not a legal issue under the First Amendment.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just say ditto. And I would just agree with him 100% on that. First Amendment citizen has the right to get out and ask questions like everyone else does, and obviously is entitled to protections, First Amendment protections.
Okay, I have another question here where you're being asked, how does your newsroom deal with the use of unnamed sources? Granted, they can be extremely helpful, but the mention of sources can sometimes imply to the audience that you're hiding something.
I ain't so with Audrey on that one.
Well, just like Joe, we have lawyers. We were very, again, back to Nexstar and my boss, Kurt Kruger, we are very careful in how we vet stories. There is a protocol with Nexstar, how many eyes look at a script. There's a protocol with unnamed sources. We are very careful. And obviously that's because of our reputation, but also lawsuits can be very costly. So there's a bottom line to this as well. But every investigation goes through our attorney, and a named source makes me nervous, and those are fully vetted.
Yeah, I would say in radio, at least for KMOX, that does not come up very often at all. We really rarely have a story where we'll use an unnamed source. And we don't really have the staff or the manpower to do like these massive investigations where we have 20 unnamed sources. So I think for us, those are more of the national stories that we would let, we're a CBS affiliate, we would let them handle that. And then any complaints, we would just say, here's the CBS newsroom in New York.
Okay, we have a couple more questions coming in on the chat. So let's try to get to one or two more of these. Let's see. On network morning shows on television, the news anchors often comment on the news reports. Does anyone feel this is hurting the credibility of journalists or news outlets because they inject their opinions into the coverage? Somebody wants to take that, why don't you?
Yeah, I would say not really. You've got an opinion, and unless you just say something stupid, and most of them, they kind of know what to say and what not to say in a legitimate operation, because they know if they say the wrong thing or say something, then they could get thrown out the door. Because generally there's somebody in management who's looking and say, what? So anyway, so most people, I think they use a reasonable, response to commenting on a story. And I don't think most of them are going to just disparage somebody who's just been on the air and just say something outlandish. Most of the time they won't. Some people sometimes will say something out of their hand, but often they pay the price for it.
I do think the flip side of that, though, just to interject for 1 second, is that the line between commentary and news, right? That can be a lot blurrier. I don't know, Deb, do you want to take that? I know you're on a station with both a lot of news and commentary.
Well, I do a 3.5-hour morning show, and I do not comment during the morning show about the hard news stories or the political stories, but often there'll be a kicker story at the end of the newscast, which is just designed, for us to show a little personality and, have a laugh. So I would hope that people can distinguish between that, because when people say that people on the air, news people, are not supposed to have an opinion, of course we have an opinion. Everyone has an opinion. So that's kind of where we try to keep it, is those kicker stories, those fun stories, or, story about the first female Eagle Scouts, something like that. Where I kind of get into more trouble is from 8:30 to 9, I do this show called Overtime, where I'm sort of the moderator on a news panel, and it's a conversation. And so it's difficult to have a conversation with other people about things that are going on without showing any opinion at all. I mean, it would be almost impossible to have a conversation without showing some opinion. And so I do get some blowback during that sometimes. That, oh, you're being biased or you're showing your opinion. Well, it was a conversation, what would conversations be without any opinion at all? So it is a fine line, and it is tough sometimes. I will be completely honest.
And just to piggyback very quickly on that, I wouldn't comment on a news story. We read the news story and move on, because most of the time when you decide to comment on it, you're asking for trouble, you're going to say the wrong thing. And then you get a call from Audrey, and she said, well, what? And so generally, as a general policy, we try to be objective. And so you try not to really interject your opinion on it could be a national or local political story, whatever it is, unless you're doing, like Debbie just said, you're doing a talk show or something like that people are asking your opinion. But just in the presentation of the news, I wouldn't offer an opinion on a news story.
Okay. We have one question here for Joe. There's a question about, what do you think about what went on in Congress about the First Amendment with Newsmax? I'm unfamiliar with Newsmax myself.
I know what Newsmax is, but I mean, is the question, were they
That's all we've got on the question. So
I really don't know how to answer that. And I have my opinions about what happened in Washington, but I'm not sure that the question is really asking me what my opinions are regarding that.
Fair enough, fair enough. I do want to ask you all, we know we have some journalism students on this call tonight, and we've been a little, maybe we've focused on some tough issues, shall we say. So I'm wondering if you can talk to me about what about your job in these really trying times kind of brings you oxygen? What keeps you going? What makes you feel like, sometimes I have the best job in the whole world? Let's start with Elliott on that.
I think it's because I really enjoy what I'm doing. Sometimes I feel like I'm getting paid to have fun. That doesn't mean I don't want to get paid, but I just enjoy what I'm doing, and I wake up and think of how can I make a difference today? What story will really make a difference? And so and a lot of it comes into why I got into the business. I got into the business to make a difference. I grew up poor, Puerto Rico, and all of that stuff, and and saying I want to make a difference in my community. I want to make the lives of people better. And with a pandemic, well, you're applying the same thing. I want to let what's important in this pandemic. Let me let people know what that is, whether in St. Charles or Lincoln County or North St. Louis, wherever they are, Madison County. I've gotten to know some great people out of Madison County and St. Charles and everywhere. And so it is all still exciting. And so I'm just driven by the love of what I do. And so that's how I would describe going in my, and so many people would say, hey, this is harder. This is tougher. There are challenges and there are things you have to do differently. But like I said, I love the profession. So there is not a negative that I approach my day with when I'm giving a task to do or something like that, because I really love what I do and I love the people I work with.
Debbie, what about you?
I would agree with Elliott. I do love what I do, and I have done other things. I haven't always been doing morning radio, although I've done it for most of my career, but I've done other jobs and I always end up back in radio because I really love it. And I love being able to communicate to people and tell people stories. And I think that all of us as journalists and reporters find our own niche of what it is that we particularly love to do. Some reporters are great with breaking news. Some people love political news. And really my forte has really become kind of feature news. And I've won a lot of awards for feature reporting because I love to kind of shine a light on people or organizations or things that are going on that people might not know about, but just people doing cool things. And I am really appreciative that the station has allowed me to do that. Like I decided, just on a whim, I did this walking tour of the Ville. And I decided, you know what, it's Black History Month. And oh my gosh, there are so many cool stories to tell. And I just said, hey, I recorded all this audio and I'm doing all these feature pieces, on like Sumner High School and Annie Malone. And they were like, okay, great. And I just got great feedback from people saying, I've lived in St. Louis my whole life and I didn't know that. And to me, that is one of those really cool things where I'm like, I get to do that. That is one of the really rewarding things about the job, is kind of finding your passion that you want to bring to the public and being able to do that.
And then Joe, why don't we turn to you, and Audrey will close with you after that.
What do I love about my job? Well, I love advising you all. I love counseling journalists. I love counseling clients in general. I can be very frustrated sometimes when they don't agree with my advice, but I understand that it's their decision to make. I enjoy it when I go home, even though it's been a long day.
And Audrey?
I love the fact that people like Elliott Davis can go out and give voice to people that have problems that public officials aren't listening to, and that we are able to help people. And I love the fact, for instance, that Mandy Murphy has been doing a series of stories, and we'll have a special next week, I don't mean to promote it, on teen suicide, and touching a chord with so many parents that because of the pandemic, because of isolation, there's a crisis with teen suicide and reaching frightening levels. And that through her stories, I said to her, if we could just help one person. So I still love, after being in this business for 40 years, I still love the power of the storytelling. And I also love being in a newsroom. I've found on a personal level that because I don't see people when I do in the lunchroom with a mask on, I make that moment count. And all of a sudden, things that I used to take for granted, I enjoy so much more. Heating up my food and talking to the engineer that I haven't seen in a long time, seeing Elliott, who I haven't seen, as I mentioned, for a long time. I miss seeing everybody. I want to be whole again, because I truly, out of all the places I've worked, Cincinnati, Miami, West Palm Beach, I love this place the most. And I love the people, and I just like being with them. They're my second family. And I could never, someone asked me, can you do TV virtually? And I said, no, because part of being in a newsroom is drinking the coffee and walking around and hanging out and having those great conversations about journalism and about life.
Well, I would say that I've really enjoyed being with all of you tonight. And I feel like we had an awfully good conversation about journalism. So thank you all so much for your time. We know you're busy, and our audience is made up primarily of people who really care deeply about journalism. So thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank
I
you.
also want to say for the audience, if you're not a member of the press club, we invite you to join. Our website is stlpressclub.org. We also have a video series that some of our press club members have been doing. It's called In the Now, and it's about how journalists do their work during the pandemic. That will be on our website soon, the first videos from that. And I really want to thank a lot of people at the press club took an active interest in this topic. It took us some time to really think about what we wanted to talk about tonight. And so I have a list of people to thank. Joan Berkman, Glenda Partlow, Laura Schnarr, Jan Scott, Dale Singer, Margaret Gillerman, Jessica Z. Brown, Audrey Prywitch, Sarah Thompson and Boyd Pickup provided technical support. We greatly appreciate their assistance this evening. And Joe Martineau is also on the press club board. And as you all may realize, he really helped me think through some of the legal issues that we might want to discuss tonight. So I appreciate that as well. Thank you all for watching and listening tonight. And again, everyone is welcome to join the St. Louis Press Club. It's a wonderful group of people who care about our society, our democracy, and a free press. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Bye, guys.
Bye. Good to see you.
Bye.
Good to
Thank
see
you
you.
so much.